The year was 1875, and the air itself felt stretched thin, like old canvas pulled over too wide a frame. This was Red Creek, a small wound of civilization weeping onto the vast, dry prairie of the Texas borderlands. It was not much more than a collection of failures and hopes baked solid by the sun. There were 2 saloons breathing sour air onto the dusty main street, a sheriff's office with a sagging porch, a trading post run by a man who weighed his thumb with the beans, and a stark white church. Beside the church stood the one-room schoolhouse, its bells silent in the afternoon heat. Beyond the town, the land rolled on forever, a sea of grass that broke against distant, flat-topped mesas. Herds of longhorn cattle, numbering in the thousands, moved like slow, brown rivers, kicking up dust that never seemed to settle. The cavalry had a fort some 20 miles east, a squat, unhappy place. And from the east, always from the east, came the sound of the railroad, hammering its way west. Spike by spike, an iron snake promising to swallow the horizon. This was the world Tahani knew, and the world he was watching die. He was perhaps 24 or 25, seasons old. He rode his pony with a casual grace that made horse and man seem one entity, his back straight, his eyes scanning the endless land. He was a Comanche, a warrior, and he could send an arrow through a running jackrabbit from 50 paces. But his skill brought him no joy, only a grim purpose. He carried the scar of memory, a night some 10 winters gone, when blue-coated soldiers had ridden through his family's camp. He remembered the smell of burning hides and the screams that were cut short. That night had burned a space inside him, a space that sometimes filled with a cold rage, and other times, a hollow ache. He served now as a scout, not for war, but for the remnants of his people who sought only to avoid the white man's iron, to find a place the railroad would not go. He understood some of the white man's harsh, guttural tongue, enough to know it was the language of broken promises. Far from that world, Evelyn Marsh had come. She was 22 years old, perhaps 23, and had left the clipped green lawns and brick sidewalks of Boston for this. She had come with a trunk full of books and a heart full of ideals. She believed that education and peace were words that could build a bridge across any chasm. She was a slender woman, and the women of Red Creek had at first looked at her soft hands and Eastern clothes with pity, assuming the frontier would break her within a month. But they had misjudged her. Beneath the fine bones and pale skin was a will of iron. She refused to be the delicate flower the saloon owner called her. She taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to a rough collection of ranchers' sons and merchants' daughters, her voice calm and steady even when a bar fight spilled into the street. She carried her own secret shame. Her father, a wealthy Boston merchant, had made a significant portion of his fortune from government contracts supplying the very army that pushed the tribes from their lands. She had not told anyone in Red Creek about that. The town, like the land, lived in a state of coiled tension. The white settlers feared the shadow on the ridge, the silent arrow, the sudden raid. The Comanche, pushed into smaller and smaller territories, feared the telegraph wire, the repeating rifle, and the final, suffocating press of settlements that would wipe them from the earth. There were whispers in Red Creek, stories told over warm beer, of a particular young Comanche warrior, one with eyes like fire, who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. They spoke his name, Tahani, with a mixture of fear and a strange, grudging curiosity. Evelyn alone seemed to hold on to a fragile belief that peace was possible, that the two worlds did not have to mean the death of one another. The tension snapped on a Tuesday afternoon, hot and breathless. A shout went up from the trading post. A crowd began to gather, spilling from the saloons and the mercantile. Evelyn, dismissing her handful of students for the day, stepped out of the schoolhouse and shaded her eyes. They were dragging a man toward the stunted cottonwood tree that grew by the sheriff's office, the only tree in town large enough to serve the purpose. He was a Comanche. He was bound at the wrists, a long rope trailing behind him, held by a triumphant cavalry trooper, Captain Briggs. A man with a face like cured leather and eyes the color of a winter sky, led the procession. Behind him, watching from the porch of the trading post, stood Silas Kane. Silas Kane owned the bank. He owned the largest cattle herd in the county. He held the contracts for the railroad right away. He owned, in one way or another, most of the people in Red Creek. He was a big man, always dressed in a clean suit, a gold watch chain gleaming on his vest. He and Captain Briggs shared a vision for the future, a vision that required this land to be swept clean of its original inhabitants. "We got him!" shouted a freighter, his voice thick with whiskey. "Caught him red-handed!" The crowd surged, their fear and frustration finding a single, sudden outlet. "Murderer!" a woman screamed. "String him up!" They said he had killed a white cowhand, a young man named Hatcher, found dead out by the creek 3 days prior. In truth, Silas Kane had paid Hatcher, and then paid 2 other men to silence him, a convenient sacrifice to spark the fire he needed. But the crowd did not need truth. They needed a release. Tani stood tall, even as they pushed him. His hair was long and black, his features sharp. He looked at the screaming faces with a contempt so pure it was almost peaceful. He did not fight them. He had been tracked by 3 soldiers, and he had let them take him. To fight would have been to die, and to die here, like this, served no one. "Get the teacher!" someone yelled. "She knows their heathen gabble." A rough hand seized Evelyn's arm. "Captain says he needs a translator to witness justice." Evelyn was pulled through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt sick. The smell of sweat and anger was suffocating. They shoved her to the front, near the tree. A man had already thrown a rope over a thick branch, the noose dangling. Captain Briggs turned to her, his smile thin. "Miss Marsh, good. You will tell this savage that he has been found guilty of the murder of one of our citizens. He is to be hanged by the neck until dead, as a lesson to his people." They shoved Tani onto a wobbling crate and cinched the noose around his throat. It was coarse and heavy. Evelyn looked at the man. His eyes, up close, were not fire. They were dark, deep, and held an intelligence that startled her. "Do you have anything to say?" Evelyn asked, her voice a dry whisper. She did not know what else to do. Tani looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the paleness of her skin, the fear in her eyes, but also something else. He spoke, his voice low and guttural. Not in Comanche, but in the broken English he had learned from traders and captives. "He was dead," Tani said, the words costing him effort. "Not me, other men. Horses with iron shoes. Army shoes." He paused, breathing hard against the rope. "I fight them. They run. I try to save him. Too late." A cold dread washed over Evelyn, sharper than her fear. It was not a plea, it was a statement, and it rang with a terrible clarity. She remembered the gossip in town. Sheriff Reed had been troubled. He had told the blacksmith that Hatcher's wounds were strange, not from an arrow. And the tracks— "He lies," Captain Briggs shouted, sensing the crowd's brief hesitation. "They all lie." "No." Evelyn's voice was suddenly, shockingly loud. It surprised even her. The crowd went silent. All eyes turned to the slender schoolteacher. "He says the men who killed Hatcher wore army shoes," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "He says he fought them. He says he tried to save the man." She turned, not to Briggs, but to the crowd, to the faces she saw in church on Sundays, the mothers of her students. "Sheriff Reed," she called out, spotting the man's tall, worn figure near the back. "You told Mr. Albright the tracks were wrong. You said the wounds were not from a lance." Sheriff Tom Reed winced. He was a man trapped, a decent man who had seen too much and now found himself in the pocket of Silas Kane over a gambling debt. Silas Kane stepped off the porch, his smile gone. "Miss Marsh, this is not a matter for women. The man is a killer." Justice must be done." "This is not justice," Evelyn cried, pointing a trembling finger at Kane, then at Briggs. "This is a lynching. You have no proof, you held no trial, you are just looking for an excuse." The air crackled. She had said the thing no one else dared. She had shamed them, and in doing so, had put herself in terrible danger. Captain Briggs's hand went to the pistol on his hip. Tani watched her, his expression unreadable, the rope still tight around his neck. "Enough," Sheriff Reed's voice boomed. Cutting through the silence, he pushed his way to the front, his face gray with resolve. He was not a brave man by nature, but he could not stomach this, not this. "Cut him down," Reed ordered, looking at his deputy. "Sheriff," Briggs sputtered, his face purpling with rage. "I said cut him down, or I will arrest you for inciting a riot." "Captain," Reed said, his voice quiet but deadly. He drew his pistol and pointed it, not at Briggs, but at the sky. "This man is a prisoner, not a spectacle. He will be held for trial, a proper trial." The crowd grumbled, cheated of their blood. Silas Kane watched, his eyes cold and calculating. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod to Briggs. The captain, after a long, hateful glare at Evelyn, sheathed his weapon and signaled his men. The deputy cut the rope from the branch, but not from Tani's neck. They pulled him off the crate. "He cannot stay in my jail," Reed said, thinking fast. "It is not secure. Briggs, your fort is the only place." "My fort is not a holding pen for your civilian problems." "Sheriff?" Briggs sneered. "Unless you are prepared to declare him an enemy combatant, in which case my justice will be much swifter than yours." They were at an impasse. If Tani went to the fort, he would be dead by morning. If he stayed in the jail, Silas's men would burn it down with him inside. Sheriff Reed looked at the angry faces, at Briggs, at Kane, and then at Evelyn Marsh, who stood alone, trembling but defiant. He had a sudden, desperate idea. It was a terrible idea. It was, perhaps, the only idea. "He will not go to the fort," Reed said. "And he will not go to jail." He grabbed Tani's arm. "He will be held in the schoolhouse. It is a stone building, defensible, and neutral ground." He looked directly at Evelyn. "And you, Miss Marsh, since you are so certain of his innocence, you will be his keeper. You will be responsible for him. He will be chained, and I will post a guard. But your word bought him this time. Now your word will keep him." It was a punishment and a threat, all in one. He was making her a pariah, chaining her to the man she had saved. Tani and Evelyn looked at each other. The dust of the street settled around them. He was no longer a symbol to her. He was a man, breathing, his chest rising and falling under the coarse buckskin. And she was no longer a white woman to him. She was something else, a puzzle, a creature who had used her voice as a weapon to stop a rope. They marched Tani into the cool, quiet dark of the schoolroom, the smell of chalk dust and old paper replacing the stench of the mob. The sheriff used a heavy chain to secure him to the iron leg of the potbelly stove, the links rattling with a dreadful finality. That night, Tani sat on the cold wooden floor of the schoolhouse, the moonlight striping the floor through the tall windows. He was a prisoner, but he was alive. He closed his eyes, the image of the white woman's face burning behind his eyelids. He saw her pale skin, the fear in her eyes, and the impossible, stubborn set of her jaw. He dreamed, not of the hunt, or of war, or of the ghosts of his family, but of a smile. A small, worried, and terribly brave smile that had appeared on her face just before she had turned to defy an entire town. The schoolhouse was silent, a cold box of moonlight and shadow. Outside, the town of Red Creek settled into an uneasy quiet, the mob's anger cooling into a suspicious simmer. The deputy whom Sheriff Reed had posted outside the door was a young man, and he had already been given a bottle by one of Silas Kane's men. He was, For all intents and purposes, useless. Inside, Evelyn Marsh sat at her desk, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. At the far end of the room, by the cold pot-belly stove, Tani sat on the floor. The chain was heavy, linking the iron cuff on his ankle to the stove's leg. His wrists were still bound with a separate length of rawhide. Evelyn rose, her legs unsteady. She was the jailer. The thought was absurd. She moved to the water bucket by the door, the dipper rattling in her trembling hand. She brought it to him, holding it out. He did not move at first, just watched her. His eyes were dark, and they held the moon. "Water," she said, her voice small. He inclined his head. She knelt, an awkward distance away, and held the dipper to his lips. He drank, his throat moving. When he finished, he did not look away. "Why?" he asked. The word was rough, forced from his throat. "Why what?" "Why stop them?" Evelyn lowered the dipper. "They were going to murder you, without a trial. It was not right." "Right," he said, tasting the word as if it were sand. "White man's right." "It was wrong by any law," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. She saw a dark stain on his buckskin sleeve, near the shoulder. A cut. "You are hurt." She went to the small cabinet where she kept her slate pencils and a few medical supplies for her students. She returned with a tin of salve and a clean rag. She sat on the floor, closer than she had intended, and gestured to his arm. "Your hands." He held out his bound wrists. The rawhide was cruelly tight. As she fumbled with the wet, stiff knot, her fingers brushed the skin of his hands. They were calloused and warm. He was breathing, a steady, slow rhythm, and she was acutely aware of the nearness of him. She smelled the dust of the prairie on him, the scent of leather, and something else, something wild and clean, like sage after a rain. When the knot finally gave out, he did not pull away. She gently pushed up the sleeve. It was a gash, shallow but dirty. She cleaned it with water from the bucket and applied the salve. Her touch was light. He watched her face, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. "You are not like the others," he said. A statement, not a question. "Who are the others?" "The white women. They come. They watch us burn. They laugh." The words hit her like a slap. She flinched, thinking of her father's ledgers, the profits from the war contracts. "I do not laugh," she said, her voice hollow. "No," he agreed. "You stand in the dust and you shout." He looked at his own hands, now free, though the chain on his ankle remained. "Why did you ask me? Why didn't I fight?" "I suppose I wondered," she said, tying the rag around his arm. "They said you were a great warrior. You let them take you." "A warrior knows when to fight," Tani said, his eyes finding hers in the gloom. "To fight 3 soldiers with rifles, when I had only a knife, is to die. My death in the dust serves my people nothing. My life, even in chains, might." She sat back on her heels, struck by the cold logic. He was not a savage. He was a man with a purpose, one who thought in terms of survival and strategy, not just blind rage. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just the warrior, but the man. He was young, his features clean and proud. Despite the exhaustion and humiliation, there was a deep, profound sadness in his eyes, a wound far deeper than the one on his arm. Evelyn retreated to her side of the room. She was torn. The law of Red Creek, the law of her people, said he was the enemy. To help him was treason. The women in town, the ones she shared tea with, would call her a traitor. She could already feel their gazes, sharp as stones, but her conscience, the small, insistent voice that had brought her west from Boston, told her that the law had become a mob, and the mob was wrong. She could not look at this man, hear his voice, and see the savage the posters described. She saw a human being trapped. Tani watched her. He had seen her type before, Or so he thought. The ones who came with their books and their talk of God. Always just ahead of the soldiers and the railroad men. They brought the rules that broke the world. But this one, she had not tried to save his soul. She had, at great risk, saved his life. He watched her retrieve a small, dark book from her desk. She sat on the simple cot in the corner, her head bowed, her lips moving silently. He recognized the ritual. Prayer. He had seen captives do it. It was their magic. He wondered what she was asking her God for. He felt a strange confusion. His hatred for the whites was a hard, cold thing, a stone in his belly. It was the only thing that had kept him warm after his family died. But this woman, with her smell of cheap soap and her sudden, fierce courage, did not fit. In the Gold Star Saloon, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of spilled whiskey. Silas Kane and Captain Briggs sat at a corner table, their voices low. "The bitch complicated it," Briggs said, slamming his glass down. "Reed has lost his spine." Silas Kane merely smiled, steepling his thick fingers. "On the contrary, Captain, she has simplified everything. The town is furious, not at us, but at her, the school teacher, siding with a savage over a dead white man. By morning, they will believe she is his woman." Briggs grunted, a dark light dawning in his eyes. "So we use that." "We use that," Silas affirmed. "This is no longer about one dead cowhand. This is about an imminent threat, a Comanche warrior inside the town with a white woman as a sympathizer. It is an insurrection. It is a conspiracy. A punitive campaign," Briggs said, the words rolling off his tongue. "I will have grounds to move to their camp, to declare them hostile." "Exactly. You will ride out at dawn, officially to secure the prisoner from the spineless sheriff and the compromised teacher. You will demand Tacni be handed over to military justice. When the tribe, which is no doubt watching, reacts, you will have your war. And you will have your land," Briggs said. "We will have our land," Silas corrected him. "The railroad needs that pass, and it will have it." He signaled a man, one of his hired guns. "Get more men. I want the town locked down tight. And tell our man at the schoolhouse to keep his eyes open." Sheriff Tom Reed sat in his office, the chair groaning under his weight. He stared at the opposite wall, at the wanted posters, his conscience screaming. He owed Silas Kane $200 from a poker game he never should have joined. That $200 had bought his silence, had bought his cooperation, until today. He had put Evelyn Marsh in an impossible position. He had done it to save his own skin, to look like he was still in charge. But he knew, as he knew his own name, that she and the Comanche would be dead by morning. Briggs would storm the schoolhouse. There would be a struggle, and the prisoner would be shot while trying to escape. The girl would be a tragic collateral. He could not let that happen. He looked at his badge, the small piece of tin that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He was trapped, but Evelyn stood up to all of them. He realized, with a sudden, bitter shame, that she was the only one in this town who had any real courage, and he had just fed her to the wolves. Unless... The idea was madness. It was the end of his career, the end of his life in Red Creek. It was also the only right thing to do. It was past midnight. The moon was high. Reed moved silently, staying in the shadows, until he was at the side of the schoolhouse. He tapped on the window, a quiet, coded rhythm. Evelyn, who had been dozing fitfully on her cot, her clothes still on, jerked awake. She saw his face at the glass and hurried to unlatch the back door. "Sheriff." "Keep your voice down," he whispered, slipping inside. He looked at Tani, who was instantly awake, alert, a coiled spring in the darkness. "You have to get out," Reed said to her, his voice rough with haste. "Both of you." "What are you talking about?" "Silas and Briggs. They are planning to start a war. At dawn, they are using you. They are going to liberate the prisoner, and when his people react, it is the excuse they need to wipe out the whole camp." Evelyn stared at him, her blood turning to ice. "Wipe them out." "This was never about Hatcher," Reed said, his voice full of self-loathing. "It was always about the land, the railroad." He fumbled in his pocket and produced a heavy iron key. "I cannot stop them. I am one man, and I am compromised. But you can." How?" "He said he was innocent." Reed nodded toward Tani. "You believed him. Now you have to prove it. You have to ride out, to the creek where Hatcher was found. You have to find the proof he spoke of, the army shoe tracks, the rifle casings, anything that proves it was not him." Evelyn's mind reeled. "Leave the town with him, I will be an outlaw, a fugitive." "Girl," Reed said, his voice gentle but firm. "In their eyes, you already are. You stood against them. This is the only chance you have, the only chance he has, the only chance any of us have is to stop a massacre." He pressed the key into her hand. "My horse, the big roan, is tied behind the church. It is the best horse I have. It can carry you both. You find that proof. You bring it back and I will stand with you. I swear, I will stand with you. But you must go, now." Evelyn looked at the key. It felt heavy as a lead. She was being asked to choose between her world, her safety, and this leap into an unknown so vast it terrified her. She looked at Tani. He had been listening, his gaze fixed on the sheriff, understanding the desperate energy, if not every word. She made her choice. She walked across the room and knelt before him, the key in her hand. "The sheriff," she said, her voice shaking. "He is giving us a way out. He says we must find the proof, at the creek." She put the key in the lock of the ankle cuff. "Will you guide me? Will you take me to the place where the man was killed?" Tani looked from her to Reed. He saw the truth in the sheriff's desperate eyes. This was not a trick. It was a gamble, the only one left on the table. He stood as the heavy chain fell away with a clang. He was taller than she remembered, a powerful, silent presence in the small room. Evelyn stood as well, facing him. "I will do this," she said, "but I must have your word." "Your sacred oath, as a warrior, that you will not harm me, that you will not abandon me out there, that you will see this through, whatever happens." Tani looked down at her, at this small, pale woman who was risking everything for a truth she only half knew. He could easily kill her and the sheriff and be gone, but he remembered her voice, shouting in the dust. He remembered her hands, gentle on his arm. He leaned in, his voice so quiet it was barely a breath, but it filled the room. "If you betray me," he said, his eyes holding hers, "I will not kill you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle on her. "I will just forget you." Evelyn shivered. It was not a threat of violence, but of something far worse, a promise of oblivion. "I will not betray you," she whispered. "Let's go," Reed urged, pushing them toward the back door. "God help you both." They slipped out into the cold night air. The roan horse was where he said, a strong silhouette against the church wall. Tani swung himself into the saddle with an easy, fluid motion. He held a hand down. Evelyn took it, and he pulled her up, seating her behind him. She put her arms around his waist, her hands clasped awkwardly, her cheek pressing against the hard muscle of his back. They moved like a ghost through the alleyways, past the sleeping houses, once they cleared the last flimsy structure of Red Creek. Tani urged the horse into a steady lope, heading not east or west, but out into the vast, silver, and dangerous freedom of the open prairie. The roan horse moved like a shadow through the sea of moon-silvered grass. The air was cold, sharp in Evelyn's lungs, and carried the distant, lonely cry of a wolf. It was a sound she had only ever heard from the safety of her small room, a sound that now seemed to be coming from just beyond the next rise. She held on to Tani, her arms locked around his waist, her face pressed against the rough buckskin of his back. She could feel the hard, lean muscles move as he guided the horse. his body shifting with an animal grace that seemed part of the land itself. She had never been this far from Red Creek. She had never been out on the prairie at night, without walls, without the comforting, familiar sounds of the town. It was terrifying. The world was too big, too dark, too empty, and yet a strange, breathless excitement hummed beneath her fear. The wind pulling at her hair felt like a kind of freedom, a wild, dangerous release from the stifling rules of her life. She was an outlaw. The thought was so foreign it almost made her laugh. Tani rode not fast, but with a steady, ground-eating lope. He seemed to be listening to the night itself. His head turned, not to look, but to hear. He heard the rustle of a quail in the brush, the distant rumble of a herd of cattle moving miles to the north, the snap of a twig that was not the wind. He knew this land by its breath, its smell, its every secret fold. "Are you cold?" he asked, his voice low, not turning his head. "I am fine," Evelyn lied, her teeth chattering. He said nothing more, but she felt him urge the horse forward. Faster. They rode for what felt like hours, the moon climbing high and then beginning its slow descent. The land changed, the rolling prairie giving way to broken country, cut by arroyos and dotted with strange, rocky outcrops. Tani finally slowed the horse, guiding it down a steep, narrow trail into a dark canyon. The walls rose up on either side, blocking the moon and trapping the cold. Evelyn felt a prickle of alarm. He was taking her into the dark, away from the light. He dismounted and helped her down. Her legs were so stiff she nearly fell, but he steadied her, his hand warm and strong on her arm for just a moment before he released her. "We rest here," he said. He led the horse under a deep overhang, a wide, shallow cave carved into the cliff wall by ancient water. It was sheltered from the wind. In moments, he had gathered dry brush from the crevices, striking a spark with flint and steel. A small, smokeless fire sprang to life, painting the sandstone walls in flickering shades of orange and red. He produced 2 strips of dried meat and a small bag of coffee from the saddlebags. He filled a tin cup with water from a canteen and set it in the coals. "Eat," he said, handing her a piece of the jerky. It was hard and salty, but she was starving. They sat by the fire, the silence broken only by the crackle of the flames and the wind howling far above them. Evelyn watched him. He seemed completely at ease, as much a part of this wild place as the rocks themselves. "How do you see this?" she asked, gesturing vaguely at the land around them. "This is your home." Tani looked up from the fire. "This is not my home." "But the Comanche, you live here?" "We are here," he corrected her, his English careful. "We belong to the land. The land does not belong to us. Your people come, they put up a fence, they say, 'This is mine.' They cut the grass, they kill the buffalo, they tear the earth for a yellow rock. They say they own it." He shook his head, a small, bitter movement. "A man cannot own his mother. How can he own the land?" Evelyn fell silent. In his simple words, he had laid bare the gulf between their 2 worlds. It was not just a disagreement over territory. It was a completely different way of seeing creation. Her father owned ships. He owned warehouses. He owned stock in railroads that sliced through this very land. She had been raised to believe that ownership was a sign of success, of civilization. To Tani, it was a violation. She shivered, the cold penetrating her thin dress. Tani noticed. Without a word, he unwrapped a bundle from behind his saddle. It was a heavy fur blanket, thick and surprisingly soft. He handed it to her. "No," she said, "that is yours. You will be cold." "I am not the one who is cold," he stated, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. He was still wearing only his buckskin shirt and leggings. She hesitated, then wrapped the fur around her shoulders. It was heavy, and it smelled of him, of sage and smoke. The warmth was immediate, seeping into her bones. He sat down by the fire again. close enough that she could feel the heat from his body. Though he did not touch her, they sat like that for a long time, sharing the small circle of warmth. Two fugitives from two different worlds, huddled together against the vast, uncaring night. A strange thought surfaced in Evelyn's mind as she watched his profile in the firelight. What if he had been born in Boston? What if he had worn a suit and come to her father's parlor for tea? The image was so absurd, it vanished instantly. And then, a more disturbing thought. What if she had been born in a Comanche camp? Would she have the strength to survive? She looked at him, and for the first time, she did not see just a warrior, or an Indian, or a prisoner. She saw a man, and she felt a strange, unwelcome flutter of safety. As dawn broke, painting the canyon rim with pale pink and gray, they were moving again. Tani pushed the horse hard, and by midday, he stopped at the edge of a dry creek bed, a scar of gravel and sun-baked mud. "This is the place," he said, sliding off the roan. Evelyn got down, her body aching from the long ride. The air was still and hot. There was a dark stain in the dirt, buzzing with flies. She looked away, her stomach turning. "He was here," Tani said, pointing. "Hatcher, he was already down. 3 men. I came from those rocks." He pointed to a jumble of boulders up the creek. "I heard the shots." "But they said you killed him." "They lied." He walked the ground like a hunter, his eyes missing nothing. "Look," he pointed. "My pony has no iron shoes." He gestured to the tracks left by the roan. Then he pointed to a set of churned-up hoof prints near the dark spot. "These do 3 horses, shod, like the cavalry." Evelyn bent closer. It was true. The tracks were sharp, with the clear crescent shape of metal shoes. "They fought," Tani continued. He walked to a patch of disturbed land. "Hatcher fought. See the drag marks? He fell, then he tried to crawl. He followed the trail a few paces. And here," he knelt and plucked something small and brassy from the dust. "Yours." He tossed it to her. It was a cartridge casing. She had seen them before. "From a rifle," she murmured. "Not Comanche," Tani said. "Army rifle. A Sharps." He scanned the ground. Found another, and then a third. "They shot him. Then they used a knife, to make it look like my people." Evelyn felt a wave of nausea. She pulled her notebook and a piece of charcoal from the small satchel she had grabbed from the schoolhouse. Her hands trembled, but she forced them steady. She began to write, documenting everything. The shod tracks, the number of shell casings, the location. She even sketched the small, distinctive shape of the casing, so different from the arrowheads they had blamed him for. This was it. This was the proof. "We have to go back," she said, her voice filled with a new, urgent energy. "We have to show Sheriff Reed." "No," Tani said, his head suddenly up, sniffing the air like a wolf. "What do you mean? No, we have the proof." "Quiet!" He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her down behind a cluster of willows. "They are coming." Evelyn heard nothing. Then she did. A faint drumming, a vibration in the earth itself, growing stronger. A moment later, she saw the dust cloud, rising in the north, and the glint of sun on metal. "Cavalry," she breathed, her heart seizing. "Briggs. He must have sent them as soon as he knew we were gone." "They are following the roan's tracks," Tani said, his voice flat. He was calculating, not panicking. "We cannot outrun them on one horse, not now." He scanned the terrain, his eyes desperate. "This way, now." He pulled her along the creek bed, running low, until they came to a narrow slit in the canyon wall, a fissure barely wide enough for a man. "In! Go deep!" Evelyn scrambled into the dark, narrow space. It smelled of dust and old water. Tani followed, pulling her farther back into the tight rock. They were pressed together, chest to back, his body a hard, warm shield behind hers. The space was so tight she could barely breathe. She could feel his heart hammering against her back, or perhaps it was her own. The sound of the horses grew, deafening. They were just outside the crevice. She heard men shouting, their voices echoing in the canyon. "The tracks end right here. Sergeant, they are in these rocks somewhere. Spread out, find them." A horse stomped and snorted. So close Evelyn felt she could reach out and touch it. She held her breath, squeezing her eyes shut, praying to a God she was not sure could hear her out here. She felt Tani's breath, warm on the back of her neck. He was utterly still. "Maybe they climbed out," another voice suggested. "In this," the sergeant scoffed. "No, they are here. Or the horse went one way and they went another." The moment stretched, each one a lifetime. Evelyn's lungs burned. Then a shadow fell over the opening of their crevice. "What about here? Sarge!" Evelyn's body went rigid. Tani's hand covered her mouth, gently but firmly, silencing the small gasp that escaped her. She saw the soldier's boot. He was peering into the darkness. He could not possibly see them. Not yet. Without thinking, driven by a raw instinct she did not know she possessed, Evelyn twisted against Tani's hand. "Wait!" she screamed, her voice high and thin in English. "Do not shoot. I am here. I am alone." The soldier jumped back, his rifle coming up. "What in God's name?" Evelyn pushed past Tani, stumbling out into the bright, cruel sunlight, blinking, her hands held high. "Please," she panted. "I am Evelyn Marsh. I was lost. I have been out here all night. I'm just collecting rock samples for my students." The sergeant, a grizzled man with a tobacco-stained beard, stared at her as if she had grown a second head. "Miss Marsh, what are you alone?" He looked at her torn dress, her wild hair, the notebook clutched in her hand. "Collecting rocks." "Yes," she said, her voice gaining a hysterical edge. "For geology. It is a fascinating subject. Do you see the stratification on that wall?" She was babbling. She was risking everything, presenting herself as a madwoman. But she was buying Tani time. She was keeping them from looking in the crevice. The sergeant looked at his men, then back at her. He clearly thought she was insane. "Ma'am, you were reported missing. With the Comanche prisoner." "Prisoner." Evelyn touched her forehead, feigning confusion. "Oh, that dreadful man. No, I fled. During the commotion, I was so frightened. I ran. I must have gotten turned around." Tani, hidden just feet away in the darkness, listened. He did not understand every word, but he understood the rhythm of the lie. He understood her tone. He saw her, a small, pale woman, standing in front of 6 armed soldiers, telling a story of madness to protect him. He had seen his own people die with courage, but he had never seen anything like this. A white woman, lying to her own kind. For him. The sergeant spat a stream of tobacco. He did not fully believe her, but her story was too strange to be an obvious lie. And she was, after all, a white woman. "Well, you are found now, ma'am. We are heading back to Red Creek. You will ride with us." "Of course," Evelyn said, trying to keep her knees from buckling. "Thank you, Sergeant." As she was helped onto a horse, she did not dare look back at the crevice. She rode away, a prisoner once more, leaving Tani alone in the rock, the vital proof still clutched in her hand. That night, after the soldiers had made a cold camp, Evelyn was given a blanket and left alone. She had failed. She had the proof, but she was a captive, and Tani was gone. But Tani was not gone. He had waited until the soldiers were miles away, then slipped from the crevice. He followed them, a ghost in the twilight, keeping to the ridges. He watched them make camp. He watched Evelyn, a small, huddled figure by their fire. He found his own camp on a high hillside, overlooking them. He sat for a long time, watching her, He thought of her small, clever lie. He remembered the feel of her body pressed against his in the dark, the scent of her hair, the panic in her breath. He remembered her smile from the schoolhouse, the one that had been worried but brave. He lay down, the cold earth beneath him, but he felt a strange warmth. He closed his eyes and slept. He dreamed. He dreamed he was sitting by a fire, and she was there. Her hair was down, tangled with wind, and she was looking at him. And in the dream, she smiled. Not a smile of fear or worry, but a real, true smile that reached her eyes. It was a smile that made the world feel new. When he woke, the sun was just rising. The soldiers were already moving. He knew what he had to do. He tracked them for another hour until they neared Red Creek. Then he cut east toward the broken lands, the lands of his people. Evelyn, riding with the soldiers, her heart a cold stone of despair, looked back. She thought she saw a shape on a distant ridge, a lone rider, sitting still as stone, watching them. Then it was gone. Tani rode hard. The proof Evelyn carried was not enough. He knew this. A piece of paper and some brass casings would not stop Silas Kane. It would be called a forgery, a lie from a madwoman. No, they needed more. They needed his people. He rode toward the Comanche camp. He would bring Evelyn there. He would have the other warriors, the ones who had been with him, tell their story to the elders. He would ask Greyhawk, the old chief, to listen. He knew it was a terrible risk. To bring a white woman, the teacher from Red Creek, into the heart of their hidden camp, it was madness. Many would want her dead on sight. But he also knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that she was the only person in the white world he could trust. He had to get her back. He had to take her to his people. It was the only way. Tani watched the 6 soldiers for 2 hours as they moved Evelyn back toward Red Creek. They were careless, riding in a loose formation, believing their prisoner was a half-mad, harmless woman. They did not know Tani was paralleling them from the ridges, a ghost in the shimmering heat. He could not fight them all. He had to use the land. He rode ahead, cutting across a dry plateau, until he was well in front of them. Positioned above a narrow pass choked with dry cheatgrass, he waited. When the soldiers were in the deepest part of the pass, he struck his flint. He touched the spark to the driest patch of grass and, fanning it with a piece of buckskin, sent a line of fire creeping down the slope. The wind was in his favor. It caught the embers and, with a sudden, greedy roar, turned the gully into a river of smoke and fire. The soldiers shouted in panic. Their horses screamed and reared, terrified of the smoke. It was not a large fire, not enough to kill them, but it was enough to blind them. It was total chaos. Get the horses turned," the sergeant bellowed. His voice choked. "Get out of the smoke." At that moment, Tani rode. He came not from the front, but from the side, bursting from a cloud of acrid, gray smoke like a spirit of the fire. Evelyn saw him, her heart leaping into her throat, before the sergeant could even draw his pistol. Tani was beside her. He did not slow. He grabbed the bridle of her horse, cutting the reins with a single, upward slash of his knife. At the same time, he seized her arm, his grip unbreakable. "Jump," he commanded. She did not hesitate. She threw herself from the saddle, and he caught her, pulling her onto the roan's back, seating her in front of him. He wheeled the horse, a single fluid motion, and plunged back into the smoke, heading not where he had come from, but deeper into a rocky arroyo the soldiers had not even seen. They were gone before the smoke cleared. By the time the sergeant had calmed his men and his horse, there was nothing left but scorched grass and the distant, fading sound of a single horse, running hard. They rode for the rest of that day and into the next, pushing deeper into the broken lands, a place the white man's maps called unsettled. Evelyn had never known such exhaustion, but she also felt a strange, wild clarity. Every tie to her old life was now severed. She was a fugitive, riding with a Comanche warrior into the heart of his own territory. They did not speak much. Tani was focused, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his ears tuned to every shift in the wind. He was taking them to his people. On the afternoon of the second day, they crested a high mesa. The land fell away before them into a vast, hidden valley. Evelyn saw nothing but grass and rock. Tani raised his hand and stopped the horse. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then, the land itself seemed to move. Like antelope rising from the grass, 5 Comanche riders appeared, seemingly from the earth. They were on paint ponies, their faces hard, their rifles and lances held ready. They were upon them in a swirl of dust, circling the roan, their ponies nimble, their eyes locked on Evelyn. She felt a cold dread far deeper than when she faced the cavalry. The soldiers had seen her as a madwoman. These men saw her as the enemy. One warrior, his face painted with black lines of war, shouted at Tani, gesturing angrily at Evelyn. He leveled his lance at her chest. Tani did not move. He spoke, his voice calm but carrying the iron of command. He used the Comanche tongue, a language of deep, flowing sounds that Evelyn had never heard. He repeated one name, sharp and clear, Greyhawk. The warrior with the lance hesitated, his eyes burning with hatred. He looked at Tani, then at Evelyn, and finally spat on the ground. He jerked his head, a clear order to follow. They were escorted into the valley, to a camp Evelyn could never have found. It was hidden in a deep canyon, beside a winding creek, sheltered by cottonwoods. Lodges of hide and branch were scattered, smoke rising from dozens of fires. The camp went silent as they rode in. Every face, women, children, old men turned to watch them, to watch her. She felt their hatred like a physical force. The women, especially, looked at her with a contempt that chilled her blood. They muttered words she did not understand, but their meaning was clear. A child, no older than 5, pointed at her and shouted "Taibo," a word that sounded like a curse. They were forced to dismount. A young warrior grabbed Evelyn's arm and roughly pulled her from the horse, shoving her to the ground. He took her satchel, the one containing her notebook and the precious shell casings. "No," Tani's voice cut through the air. He stepped between the warrior and Evelyn, his face a mask of cold fury. He was home, and here, he was not a prisoner. He was a warrior. He spoke again, his words sharp, and the young man stepped back, his face sullen. Tani pulled Evelyn to her feet and, with his hand on her back, guided her through the staring crowd to the largest lodge, which sat in the center of the camp. An old man sat by the fire, his face a map of 100 years. His hair was gray, braided with otter fur, and his eyes, when he lifted them, seemed to see right through her. This was Greyhawk, Tani's father's friend. Tani spoke for a long time. He told of the rope in Red Creek, of the plan by Silas Kane and Captain Briggs. He told of the dried creek bed and the army casings. Then he put his hand on Evelyn's shoulder. He told of her lie to the soldiers, how she had stood in the dust to save him. When he finished, the lodge was silent. Another man spoke, a hard, scarred warrior Evelyn had seen outside. He wanted her dead. He called her a spy, a white woman who brought only disease and soldiers. He said Tani was bewitched, his mind poisoned. The lodge filled with angry agreement. Several men rose, their hands on their knives. "She is not the enemy," Tani shouted, pushing Evelyn behind him. "She is the only truth we have. We are blind, fighting a ghost. She has seen the ghost. She knows his name. If we kill her, we are killing our own chance to survive." Greyhawk raised one hand. The lodge fell silent. He looked at Evelyn, a long, piercing gaze that seemed to peel back her skin. He saw her fear, but he also saw the iron will beneath it. "A wolf that eats the bait is a fool," Greyhawk said, his voice like stones grinding together. "A wolf that blames the bait and not the trapper. is a greater fool. He looked at the other warriors. She will stay. We will listen. He then fixed his eyes on Evelyn. But if her heart speaks with a false tongue, her blood will answer for it. Evelyn was not a prisoner, but she was not free. She was assigned to the lodge of a woman named Willow Woman, whose husband and son had been killed by cavalry 2 seasons prior. The woman's grief was a cold, hard shell. She treated Evelyn not with cruelty, but with a profound, crushing indifference. For days, Evelyn lived in the camp. She, who had taught logarithms and poetry, was now taught to grind corn with a stone, a task that left her hands raw and bleeding. She learned to find the driest wood, to keep a fire with damp buffalo chips, to clean hides with a scraper, her muscles aching with the effort. She was clumsy, useless, a pale, soft thing in a world of hard necessities. But she also watched. She saw children laugh, racing dogs through the camp. She saw old women, their faces like wrinkled apples, telling stories to the young, their hands moving in graceful patterns. She saw the warriors mourning a hunter who had fallen, their grief raw and human. She watched them pray at sunrise, their voices rising in a harmony that was older than the mountains. This was not the savage, bloodthirsty horde from the Boston papers. This was a community, a people with history, with families, with a profound connection to the land she had just begun to understand. The shame she felt for her father, for her own ignorance, was a physical ache. Tani did not come to her lodge. It would not have been right. But in the evenings, when the camp settled, he would find her by the creek, where she went to wash the grime from her hands and face. They stood in the twilight, the sound of the water a quiet veil between them. "This is hard for you," he said.
"It is,"
she admitted, her voice quiet.
"They hate me."
"They fear you," he corrected. "They see the color of your skin, and they see the end of all this." She finally found the courage to say the words that had haunted her. "Tani, my father. He is a merchant in Boston. He is a rich man." Tani waited, watching her face in the gloom.
"He makes his money,"
she whispered, the words choking her.
"From the war. He has contracts. He sells the blue coats, their rifles, their cannons, and their food. He is Silas Kane, just in a bigger house. I came here. I told myself I was bringing education, but I was just running from his name. I am part of the machine that is killing you."
She finally looked at him, her eyes streaming, expecting to see his contempt. Tani was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "In my family's camp I had 10 winters. The bluecoats came, with the big guns, the ones that shout." He touched a faint scar above his eye. "I was hit, not with a bullet, with a piece of wood, from my own lodge. When the cannon hit it, I fell, in the dust. I hid, I watched." He stopped, his throat working. "I watched the fire. I smelled it as a smell I will never forget. I held a knife, a small one, for skinning rabbits. I swore I would cut the iron heart from every white man, that I would see their railroad buried under the bodies of its builders." He looked at her, his eyes holding hers, sharing a pain that went beyond words. "My hate was clean," he said. "It was pure, until you stood in the dust. You shouted. You make my hate confused." Before Evelyn could answer, a shout came from the edge of the camp. A rider, slumped over his horse, was being helped down. They ran back. It was a young scout, Running Fox. He was not wounded, but exhausted, his horse lathered and near death. He had been to Red Creek. He had hidden for a day. Listening, he was brought before Greyhawk, and his words brought a new, cold terror to the camp. "They are coming," he panted, gulping water. "Briggs and Kane. I hid under the saloon. I heard it all. They are not waiting for a trial. They say Tani kidnapped the teacher." He pointed at Evelyn. "They are using you as an excuse. Briggs is gathering his men. Silas is giving rifles and free whiskey to any man in town who will ride. They plan to rescue you and punish the tribe. When? Greyhawk's voice was sharp.
3 days,
Running Fox said. In 3 days, they will attack.
The lodge exploded. The scarred warrior, Stonehoof, drew his knife. We are riding now. We will burn Red Creek to the ground before they can move.
No, Tani roared, his voice silencing the rising panic. That is what they want. They are waiting for us. They will have their big guns. We will ride into a trap. We will be slaughtered, and they will call it justice.
Then we hide,
Stonehoof sneered.
We run.
No, Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension. Every eye turned to her. She was pale, but her eyes were clear. She looked at Tani, then at Greyhawk. Their plan, she said, her voice gaining strength, is built on a lie. They say Tani kidnapped me. That is their excuse. It is, someone shouted. So we destroy the lie, she continued. What if they drive out here to rescue me and I am not here? Greyhawk tilted his head, listening.
What if,
she said, her voice shaking but her idea taking shape. Tani and I rode back to Red Creek. Together. We go to Sheriff Reed. We bring him the proof, the shell casings, my notebook. We show the town, all the people, not the ones Silas owns, the others, the blacksmith, the women, the families. We tell them the truth, in front of the church. We show them that Tani is not a kidnapper, and I am not a victim. It was an insane idea. Stonehoof laughed. A trick she will lead him to the rope. She is right, Tani said, his voice low, his eyes bright with the terrible genius of it. It is the one thing they will not expect. We will shatter their story. And you, he said, looking at Greyhawk and the other warriors, you will be close, hidden in the hills above the town. You will not attack. You will wait. If they listen, we have peace. If they try to harm us, if they try to make us liars, then the town will see who the real murderers are. The gamble was terrifying. Their lives are on the line. The tribe's survival is on the line. Greyhawk stood. A slow, creaking movement. He walked to the fire and looked into the flames. He then turned and looked at Evelyn, and then at Tani. A river, the old chief said, his voice quiet, does not need to choose between two banks. It only needs to find its way to flow. You two are the water. He nodded. A single, sharp movement. Go! Take the proof. Speak the truth. The tribe will be ready. He placed a hand on Tani's shoulder, and his other on Evelyn's. His eyes were old, and filled with a deep, bottomless sadness. But know this, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. One of your two hearts will bleed before the dawn of peace arrives. The prophecy hung in the smoky air, a cold weight. Tani and Evelyn looked at each other. They would ride at first light. They left the Comanche camp just before dawn, riding the single strong roan horse the sheriff had provided. Tani rode in front, Evelyn seated behind him, her arms once again locked around his waist. But everything was different. They were not captive and guard. Not white and Indian. Not anymore. They were two people riding toward a storm, allied by a truth that could get them both killed. The horse was strong, and Tani pushed it, knowing they had only 2 days to stop a war. The shared ride created a forced, constant intimacy. Evelyn was pressed against his back, feeling the shift and pull of his muscles with every move the horse made. When the roan stumbled on a loose rock, she slipped, her grip loosening instantly. Tani's left hand left the reins, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her secure against him with a strength that was both reflexive and protective. I am all right, she murmured, her face hot, her heart hammering from the near fall. Hold tighter, he commanded, his voice low, his arm lingering for a moment before he returned his hand to the horse's mane. She did as he said, her hands clasping each other, her cheek resting on the hard plane of his back. She could feel his heartbeat, slow and steady, a counter-rhythm to her own frantic pulse. She was no longer just holding on, she was holding him. They rode all day, stopping only to water the horse at a hidden spring Tani knew. They ate dried meat and berries, sharing a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with 1,000 unsaid things. They were a team, a single unit moving across the vast, empty prairie, their purpose singular. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and blood orange, the wind changed. It stopped being the prairie's gentle breath and became a low, angry moan. The air grew heavy, thick, and the temperature began to plummet. Tani pulled the horse to a halt on a low rise, sniffing the air. "It comes," he said.
What?
Evelyn asked, looking at the darkening sky. "The wind, a big one." He urged the horse forward, his eyes scanning the horizon, looking for something. The first drops of rain, hard and cold as pebbles, began to fall. Within minutes, the sky opened. It was not a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a solid wall of water that soaked them instantly. The wind howled, pushing against them, turning the rain to horizontal ice. "We must find shelter," Evelyn shouted over the roar. Tani nodded, his face grim. He guided the horse into a dry arroyo, the flash floods already beginning to turn the dust to mud. He followed the wall of the canyon, his eyes searching. Then he saw it, a dark slit in the rock, a deep crevice, almost a cave. He slid off the roan and pulled Evelyn down. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. He shoved her toward the opening. "In!" He slapped the horse on the rump, sending it to huddle in the lee of the canyon wall, then plunged into the rock shelter after her. It was not a cave, but a deep, narrow fissure, protected from the wind and, mostly, the rain. But the cold followed them in. It was a damp, bone-chilling cold that seemed to rise from the stone itself. Tani tried to make a fire. He had his flint and steel, but the sparse brush he managed to find was soaked. He struck spark after spark, his hands raw, but the tinder would not catch. It just hissed, a small, defeated sound in the vast roar of the storm. He finally sat back, defeated, the useless flint in his hand. Evelyn was huddled against the rock wall, her body racked with violent shivers. Her teeth were chattering so loudly she could barely speak. "It is so cold, Tani." He looked at her. Her lips were turning blue. Her soaked dress was plastered to her body, sucking the heat from her. He looked at his own clothes. He was just as wet. He knew this cold. He had seen it kill. It was the death cold, the kind that numbs the mind before it stops the heart. He had the thick fur blanket from the Comanche camp, still rolled and tied in its oilskin wrap, protected from the rain. But one blanket was not enough, not against this. "We must get warm," Evelyn whispered, her words slurring. "We will die." He knew she was right. He knew there was only one way. It was a thing his people knew, a hard, practical lesson of survival. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the gloom. "There is one way, but it is not the white man's way." "What?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Your clothes," he said, the English words feeling thick and strange on his tongue. "They are wet. They are killing you. Mine also. We must take them off." Evelyn stared at him. The implication was stark, terrifying. It violated every rule of modesty, of decency she had ever known. She was a teacher, a lady from Boston. "Take them off. And get in the fur, together, the skin to skin. It is the only way our heat will be enough." She looked away, a hot wave of shame washing over her, immediately cooled by another violent shiver. She was a dead woman. She could die here, of the cold, preserving her modesty for a shallow grave. Or she could trust him, not just with her life, but with this. She turned back to him, her gaze meeting him. He was not looking at her with desire. He was looking at her with the same grim practicality he'd had when he'd read the tracks at the creek.
He was trying to save her life. "All right,"
she whispered, her voice barely audible. With fumbling, frozen fingers, she turned her back to him and began to work on the tiny buttons of her dress. Her hands were useless. She was crying, silent tears of frustration and cold.
"I cannot."
He moved behind her. She went rigid. "Hold still," he said, his voice gentle. His fingers, though cold, were nimble. He undid the buttons on her back, his touch light, impersonal. He moved away as she shrugged the wet, heavy dress from her shoulders. It fell to the floor of the cave with a sodden thump. She stood in her wet chemise and layers of undergarments, shaking uncontrollably. He turned his own back, shrugging out of his buckskin shirt, kicking off his leggings. The air hit his bare skin, and he hissed, a sharp intake of breath. He unrolled the fur blanket, a thick, warm bison hide, and spread it on the driest patch of ground. "Quickly," he said. Evelyn, her mind numb with cold and the sheer impossibility of the moment, shed her remaining wet layers. For a second, she stood naked in the dark, more vulnerable than she had ever been in her life. Then she slipped under the heavy fur, her skin screaming as it touched the cold ground. Tani slid in beside her, pulling the heavy fur over both of them. It was awful. Their skin was like ice. The contact was a shock, cold against cold. They lay stiffly, inches apart, not touching, the raw, animal fact of their nakedness a wall between them. But the cold was too strong. The shivering was too violent. "It is not working," Evelyn chattered. "We must," Tani said, his voice strained. He turned on his side, and with a movement that was both hesitant and resolute, he pulled her against him. She gasped as her bare back met his bare chest. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his legs tangling with hers. Her head was tucked under his chin, her face against the warm skin of his neck. He pulled the fur tighter, sealing them in a small, dark cocoon of shared space. For a long time, they just lay there, shivering, their bodies fighting a desperate war against the cold. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a small spark of shared warmth began to glow between them. Their shivering began to lessen, to synchronize. His body heat was a furnace, seeping into her, and hers into him.
"Better,"
he whispered, his breath warm in her hair.
"Yes,"
she breathed, her voice muffled. She was pressed against him so tightly she could feel his heartbeat, a strong, slow rhythm against her ribs. She was aware of all of him, the hard muscle, the smooth skin, the scent of him. No longer just sage and dust, but the clean, male scent of him.
"I was so afraid,"
she confessed, the words coming unbidden in the dark. Intimate space, not just of the cold, in the town. When they put the rope on you, I thought, what if I'm too late? He tightened his arm around her. "You were not late." "And tomorrow," she said, her voice small, "when we go back, I am afraid of them. Tani, of Silas, of their faces. They will not believe us." "I am also afraid," he admitted, the confession costing him. "I am afraid for my people, and I am afraid for you." She tilted her head back, looking up at his face, a collection of shadows in the dark. You are small," he said, searching for the word. "Small, and you shout, like a wren, fighting a hawk." A small, choked laugh escaped her. "A wren." "A brave one." His hand, which had been resting on her back, moved, his fingers tracing the line of her shoulder, then her neck. His touch was no longer just for warmth. It was a question. She did not pull away. She leaned into it, a silent response. She had never been touched like this, with a tenderness that was both fierce and hesitant. All the fear, all the tension, all the days of running, culminated in this one impossible moment. He was the enemy who had saved her. She was the outsider who had stood for him. He lowered his head, and his lips found hers in the darkness. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hard and desperate, and full of the storm that raged outside and the storm that had been building between them for days. It was a kiss of survival, of a truth that was more powerful than any law or any lie. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, pulling him closer, erasing the last fraction of an inch between them. This was not a Boston lady and a Comanche warrior. This was a man and a woman, stripped bare, finding life in the face of death. He shifted, his body covering hers, the fur blanket a heavy, warm world around them. His name, he realized, was not just a name. Tani, it meant dreamer in a forgotten dialect. And he had dreamed of her smile, a pale, distant light. But the dream was nothing. The reality was her, warm and alive in his arms, her breath catching, her body trusting him, surrendering to him in the dark. He was no longer dreaming of a smile. He was holding the woman, his light after the storm, and she was, in this moment, entirely his. When they woke, it was a world of blinding white light. The storm had passed. Sunlight streamed into the mouth of the crevice, hitting a sheet of ice that had formed overnight, refracting into 1,000 rainbows. They were still tangled together, her head on his chest, the heavy fur warm around them. The silence was absolute. Evelyn's eyes opened first. She remembered, instantly, and a hot blush spread from her neck to her face. She was naked, in the arms of a Comanche man. By the cold light of day, the shame of her upbringing rushed in. She tried to pull away, but his arm tightened, gently. "Do not," he said, his voice thick with sleep. He looked at her. Her hair was a wild tangle around her face, her eyes wide, a mix of fear and something new. He had never seen anyone so beautiful. He touched her cheek. "In my language," he said, his voice low, "we have a name for the light that comes after the great storm. It is Tana Pakani. It means the first true light." He looked at her, his gaze holding hers. "That is your name." She stared at him, the shame receding, replaced by a profound, aching tenderness. He had not taken her. He had seen her. He had given her a name. "Tana Pakani," she whispered, trying the sounds. "Evelyn," he said, trying her name. It still felt strange. "We must go." The shared knowledge of what had passed hung between them, a new, unspoken bond, as they dressed in their still damp, cold clothes. The world had not changed, but they had. They were no longer just allies. They were something else, something for which neither of their worlds had a name. They rode into Red Creek just before noon. The town was alive, but not with its usual business. Men with rifles were everywhere. They gathered in front of the saloon, taking bottles from Silas Kane's men. Captain Briggs was on the street, shouting orders. When Tani and Evelyn rode down the main street, the town stopped. Every single eye turned to them. The silence was absolute, heavier and more dangerous than the silence of the prairie. A woman, Mrs. Albright, whose son Evelyn taught, pointed a finger. "It is her, the teacher." "She is with him," a man shouted. "He did not take her. She went with him." The crowd turned, the whispers growing into a low, angry growl. "Tainted," a woman spat. "Comanche lover." Silas Kane smiled from the porch of the saloon. This was better than he could have planned. He had wanted to make her a victim. The town had just made her a pariah. Her word was now worthless. "Clear the way," Sheriff Reed shouted, pushing through the crowd, his face pale and set. He had seen them coming. "Miss Marsh, get inside. Get in the church." "That is where we are going." "Sheriff," Evelyn said, her voice clear, though her hands, holding the reins Tani had given her, were shaking. They dismounted in front of the small white church. The crowd followed. A silent, menacing mob. Briggs and Kane came with them, their faces triumphant. Inside, the church was cool and quiet, but it soon filled with the angry, curious faces of the town. "What is this, Miss Marsh?" Silas Kane asked, his voice booming with false concern. "This savage has done something to you. He has bewitched you." "He has done nothing but save my life," Evelyn said, walking to the front, Tahni at her side. "As I saved him, we are here to show you the truth." She laid her notebook on the pulpit. She placed the 3 brass shell casings beside it. "These were found at the site of Hatcher's death," she declared, her teacher's voice filling the room. "These are Army shell casings, not from a Comanche bow. And these," she tapped her notebook, "are drawings of the tracks, from shod horses." A murmur went through the crowd. Sheriff Reed stepped forward, picking up one of the casings. "She is right. This is an Army issue." "It is a trick," Captain Briggs roared. "A lie. He has fed her this story. He is a savage, and she is a compromised woman." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. "She spent 2 nights on the prairie with him," Silas Kane added, his voice dripping with pity. "We cannot hold her accountable for what she says. She is clearly unwell." "I am not unwell," Evelyn cried, her control snapping. "I am telling the truth. Tahni was not the killer. You—" She pointed a shaking finger at Silas. "You and Captain Briggs. You wanted an excuse. You wanted to start a war to steal their land." The accusation was out. The church gasped. "She is mad," Briggs said, shaking his head, a look of sad duty on his face. "She is a whore!" a man shouted from the back. Evelyn flinched as if struck. Tahni's hand went to the knife at his belt, but she put her hand on his arm, stopping him. "You must choose to believe," she pleaded to the crowd, to the faces she knew. "This is not about me. It is about a lie. It is about a massacre you are about to commit." "Miss Marsh," Silas Kane said, his voice suddenly kind. He stepped forward, picking up the small Bible from the pulpit. "We are all confused. Let us clear the air." He held the Bible out to her. "Just tell us, simple and plain. Swear on this holy book. Do you have any affection for this savage? Tell us you feel nothing for him. Tell us he is your enemy. Do that, and perhaps we can—" He smiled. "We can begin to understand your confusion." The entire town was silent. This was the true trial. Not of Hatcher's murder, but of her. She could lie. She could say the words, renounce Tahni, and save some small, tattered piece of her reputation. She would be the poor, confused Miss Marsh. She looked at Tahni. He stood, his face a proud, hard mask. He expected this. This was the white man's way. He was ready for her to betray him to save herself. She saw his eyes, and in them, she saw the man who had pulled her from the fire, the man who had shared his last piece of jerky, the man who had wrapped her in his own fur, the man who had held her, warm and safe, through the death cold, the man who had called her the first true light. She turned back to Silas, her gaze clear and her hands, she noted with a distant surprise, no longer shaking. She did not touch the Bible. She waited 1 beat, 2 beats. Then she spoke, her voice not loud, but it filled every corner of the church. "If loving the truth is a sin," she said, her eyes locked on Silas Kane's, "then today I sin once more." The silence in the church was a living thing, stretched thin and brittle. Evelyn's words, "I sin once more," hung in the air, a final, unmovable declaration. Captain Briggs's face, which had been triumphant, contorted with rage. He saw his plan, his war, his justification, all of it, being undermined by a slip of a woman who had, by all rights, been silenced. He drew his sidearm. The sound of the hammer clicking back was deafening in the small church. "This is not a church," he roared, his voice cracking.
This is a nest of traitors. I declare this woman, Evelyn Marsh, and this savage, Tani, to be conspirators in an active insurrection against the laws of the United States. They are spies."
He pointed his pistol at Tani. "And I am ending this." "No." Sheriff Tom Reed's voice was even louder. He had moved without anyone noticing, and his own pistol was now leveled. Not at Briggs, but at the center of his chest. "You are not, Captain, not in my town, not while I wear this badge." The church erupted. People screamed and scrambled for the doors. "This is not your town, old man," Briggs sneered, his eyes hard and confident. He knew he had the numbers. "This is military jurisdiction now. My men are outside. Men!" he bellowed. "Seize them all!" He had overplayed his hand. He expected the town to cower. "Like hell you will," a new voice growled. It was Albright, the blacksmith, a man built like one of his own anvils. He stood in the doorway, a heavy shotgun in his hands. Beside him stood two old ranchers, men who had fought in the war, men who knew real killing and hated it. They were holding rifles. "Reed is the law here, Briggs," Albright said, his voice a low rumble. "We do not much like his decisions today, but he is the law, and you are not." Silas Kane, who had been watching from the side, saw his control of the moment evaporating. "This is madness. They are Comanche. They are here to kill us all." "No," Tani said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the panic. He looked at Evelyn. "Now," he whispered. She understood. She ran to the church bell, grabbing the thick rope, and pulled. The sound of the bell, ringing frantic and wild, was not the sound of a fire or a meeting. It was the sound of an alarm. But Tani, while she pulled, had stepped to the open door. He grabbed the heavy iron bar used to lock it, and with a strength she had not seen, hurled it onto a pile of dry firewood stacked against the church wall. He struck his flint to a dry rag, and in a second, a thick, greasy column of smoke began to pour from the wood pile. It was not an attack, it was a signal to Greyhawk, waiting in the hills, a signal that said, "We are trapped. Do not attack. Prepare." "He is burning the church," Silas screamed, finally finding the lie he needed. "They are burning the town." "Get out," Reed roared, shoving Evelyn toward the side door. "Tani, with me, Albright. Hold the front." They spilled out into the chaos of the street. Briggs's soldiers, seeing the smoke and hearing the bell, were running forward, their rifles ready. The town was in a full-blown panic. "To the east," Briggs shouted, mounting his horse. "He has signaled his war party. They are coming. We rode to meet them. We end this now." He was turning the chaos to his advantage. He formed his dozen troopers into a line. Behind them, the drunk, armed men from the saloon, hired by Silas, formed a ragged second wave. "Reed," Briggs shouted, his face a mask of hate. "You are either with us or against us. Make your choice." Sheriff Reed looked at the blacksmith, at the two old ranchers, and at Evelyn, who was reloading the pistol he had thrust into her hand. He looked at Tani, who was not looking at Briggs, but at the hills, his face a mask of anguish, fearing his signal had been misunderstood. "I am standing with the law, Captain," Reed said, his voice flat. He chambered a fresh round. "And you are not it." "So be it." Briggs wheeled his horse. "Forward." The impromptu cavalry thundered down the main street, kicking up a storm of dust, heading for the open prairie on the east side of town. "We have to stop them," Evelyn said, her voice desperate. "Greyhawk is out there. They are riding into an ambush or a massacre." "They are riding to start a massacre," Reed corrected her, his face grim. He mounted his own horse, tethered nearby. "Albright, you and the others, stay here, protect the town. If this goes bad, you are all they have." "Sheriff, you cannot ride into that," the blacksmith protested. "Tani, Evelyn, with me," Reed said. "We may not be able to stop them, but we sure as hell can be a witness." They rode hard, cutting through the alleyways to get ahead of the main body, the roan horse carrying Tani and Evelyn, and Reed on his own bay. They burst onto the open prairie just as Briggs's men cleared the town. The land here was flat, a wide open field rising to a low set of hills about a mile away. And on that rise, as if summoned from the earth, was a line of Comanche riders. It was not a war party. It was perhaps 30 men, led by Greyhawk. They were not charging. They were simply sitting on their ponies, a silent, painted line, blocking the pass. They had seen the smoke, heard the bell, and had moved not to attack, but to defend. Briggs pulled his men to a skidding halt, the two lines facing each other across 500 yards of open grass. The air was thick with a terrible, silent tension.
"This is it,"
Briggs said, his voice triumphant. "An open declaration of war." He turned to his men. "First rank, prepare to—" "Hold your fire!" Reed's voice roared as he, Tani, and Evelyn rode into the space between the two lines. They rode to the center, a 50-yard gap between either side, and stopped, turning to face Briggs. 3 people, on 2 horses, in the middle of a killing field. "Briggs," Reed shouted, "you will not fire. These men are not on town land. They are not attacking. You do this, and it is murder." "Get out of the way! Reed!" Briggs screamed, his face livid. "You are consorting with the enemy. That is a hanging offense."
"Then hang me," Evelyn's voice, clear and high, carried across the field.
"But you will not use me as an excuse. I was not kidnapped. I am here by my own choice, to stop a lie." The soldiers in the front rank looked at each other, their rifles suddenly heavy. This was not what they had been told. Silas Kane, who had ridden out with the hired guns, saw the moment slipping. He saw the hesitation. He knew his investment was about to be lost. He rode up behind a hard-faced man, one of his own gunmen. "Start it," Silas whispered. "Start it now." The gunman, hidden in the second rank, raised his rifle, aimed not at the Comanche, but at the sky, and fired. The shot cracked, loud and final. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Both sides, hearing the shot, believed the other had opened fire. "Fire!" Briggs bellowed, his voice filled with glee. The field exploded. The cavalry line erupted in smoke and flame. On the hill, the Comanche warriors, seeing the fire, lost their first volley of arrows and returned rifle fire. Horses screamed. Men shouted. The air was instantly filled with the whistle of bullets and the thrum of arrows. Evelyn, Tani, and Reed were trapped in the middle. "Down!" Tani yelled, launching himself from the roan, dragging Evelyn with him. They hit the ground, rolling into a shallow buffalo wallow, a depression in the earth, just as a spray of bullets tore through the air where they had been. Reed was not so lucky. His horse, struck in the neck, went down, pinning his leg. "Sheriff!" Evelyn screamed. Tani was already moving, keeping low. He scrambled from the wallow to the downed horse, ignoring the bullets that kicked up dust around him. He put his shoulder under the horse's neck and heaved, his muscles screaming, freeing Reed's leg. He dragged the sheriff back to the safety of the wallow as Reed fired his pistol at the advancing line of hired guns. The battle was chaotic. It was not a formal fight, but a swirling, confused melee. Briggs, on his horse, was trying to rally his men for a charge. "Wipe them out! Wipe them all out!" He saw Tani, a clear target, and rode toward him, his saber drawn. "You, savage! This is the end for you!" Tani shoved Reed's pistol back into the sheriff's hand and rose from the ditch, his own knife bare. "Tani, no!" Evelyn screamed, grabbing his arm. He looked at her, his eyes blazing, and for a second, she saw the cold killer from the campfire story. Then he smiled, a quick, grim flash. "He has come for me," he said. "This is not his fight. It is mine." He stepped out onto the open field. Briggs saw him and laughed, wheeling his horse. "You will fight a mounted man with a knife. You are a fool." He charged, his saber raised for a downward cut. Tani did not move. He waited, at the last possible second. As the horse was upon him, Tani dove, not away, but under the horse's neck, rolling. He came up on the other side as Briggs, his swing missing, tried to control the mount. Tani grabbed the stirrup, grabbed Briggs's leg, and pulled. The captain, caught off guard, was hauled from the saddle, landing with a heavy, armored thud. He rose, his saber in one hand, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He was a big man, but Tani was faster.
"You should have stayed in the trees, Redskin,"
Briggs panted, advancing. "You should have stayed in your own land," Tani replied, circling. Briggs lunged, a military thrust. Tani dodged, the blade singing past his ear. Briggs swung, a heavy cut. Tani ducked, the blade taking a lock of his hair. "You come here," Briggs hissed. "You take our land, you steal our women."
"I take nothing," Tani said. "You are the man who burns lodges. You are the one."
He remembered the smell of the smoke, the screams. His hate, no longer confused, became a cold, sharp tool. He saw the lunge before Briggs even began, a desperate, angry thrust. Tani stepped inside the blade's arc. Bringing his own arm up, he drove his knife, not into the chest, but deep into the side, under the ribs, an upward, twisting motion. Briggs stopped, his eyes wide. He looked down at the knife buried in his side, then up at Tani. He opened his mouth, but only a wet, red gasp came out. Then, from the line of hired guns, a rifle cracked. Tani, standing over the captain, felt a white-hot hammer blow to his right side. He staggered, a look of profound surprise on his face. He saw Evelyn, her face a perfect white circle of horror. He tried to take a step toward her. He fell, face down, in the dusty grass. The field, for a second, went silent. Briggs was dead. Tani was down. "Cease fire!" Sheriff Reed roared, rising from the ditch, his face a mask of terrible authority. "Cease fire, or I will shoot the next man who pulls a trigger!" The cavalry soldiers, their captain dead, their purpose gone, lowered their rifles. The Comanche, seeing their warrior fall, but also seeing Briggs fall, did not advance. Greyhawk held his hand up, a sign to hold. "Tani!" Evelyn's scream was raw, an animal sound of pure agony. She ran from the ditch, heedless of the danger, and fell to her knees beside him. She turned him over. His eyes were closed. A dark, bubbling stain was spreading across the buckskin on his side. "No," she whispered, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the wound. "No, no, no, you cannot leave me, not now." Silas Kane, seeing his entire plan in ruins, tried one last time. "He is dead, the savage is dead, but the rest of them are still there. Finish them." "No," Sheriff Reed said, walking toward him, his pistol still smoking. He pointed at the hired gun who had fired the shot. "I saw you. You shot that man. And you?" He looked at another. "I saw you fire the first shot, from Silas Kane's side." The townspeople, who had come out to watch the battle, had seen it too. The blacksmith, Albright, pointed his shotgun at Kane. "We saw it, Silas. We saw it all. You started this. You brought this on us." The power had shifted. The soldiers looked to Reed. The civilian law. Not Kane, the money, the hired guns, seeing their leader dead and their paymaster exposed, began to slink away. But Evelyn did not see any of it. She was kneeling in the dust, her dress stained with blood, her world reduced to the man who lay, still and silent, in her arms. The chief's prophecy had come true. A heart was bleeding, and the dawn felt a long, long way off. The battlefield was a sudden, stunned vacuum. The gunfire, which had been a deafening roar, was replaced by the sound of the wind, the groans of wounded men, and a single desperate cry from Evelyn. Greyhawk and his warriors rode slowly down from the ridge, not in attack, but with a grim purpose. Sheriff Reed, his face pale, his leg bleeding but not broken, stood tall. "It is over," he yelled, his voice carrying the authority of his badge and the weight of the day. "The fighting is done. We will tend to the living. We will bury the dead. And then we will have a reckoning." The cavalry troopers, leaderless and ashamed, began to dismount. 2 of them were already making a crude litter for the body of Captain Briggs. But Evelyn saw none of this. Her world had shrunk to the man in her arms.
"He is breathing," she whispered, her hands covered in his blood. "He is breathing."
Willow Woman, the Comanche woman who had treated Evelyn with such coldness, was suddenly at her side, kneeling in the dust. She had come with the warriors, carrying the medicine bundles. She looked at Evelyn, then at Tani, and her expression softened from hatred to a fierce, practical concern. "We move him," she said in broken English. "Now." They carried him, a strange procession of white and Comanche, back to the town, not to the church or the jail, but to Albright's warehouse, a large, quiet space that smelled of hay and cold iron. They laid him on a pile of clean canvas. For 2 days, Tani lived in a gray world between life and death. The bullet had gone clean through, but it had taken part of his side, tearing muscle and leaving a ragged, gaping wound. Evelyn did not leave. She bathed his face. She gave him water. She held his hand, and Willow Woman, in a silent truce, worked beside her. The Comanche woman applied poultices of yarrow and sage to stop the bleeding and fight the fever, while Evelyn used carbolic acid from the town's small dispensary to keep the wound clean. They were 2 women from opposite worlds, united by the man they both, in their own ways, sought to save. He thrashed in a fever dream. He was back in the burning lodge, calling for his mother. He was on the field, facing Briggs, and then his eyes, still closed, seemed to find Evelyn. He clutched her hand, his own hand burning with fever. "Tanapakani," he whispered, the Comanche words slurring. "Do not go. Tanapakani, my light." Willow Woman, who was changing the dressing, froze. She looked at Evelyn, her dark eyes wide. She understood. She had heard the story of the storm. She looked at this pale, shaking white woman. For the first time, she saw not an enemy, but the other half of a bond she had never believed possible. She placed a hand over Evelyn's, a silent gesture of acceptance. While Tani fought for his life, the town of Red Creek fought for its soul. Sheriff Reed, his leg bandaged, his face like granite, convened a meeting in the street. In the cold light of the next day, he stood on the porch of the trading post, and this time, Silas Kane was not on the porch with him. He was standing in the dust below, surrounded by Albright and the 2 old ranchers, who held their rifles not in threat, but with a quiet, final purpose. "You all saw it," Reed said, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. "You saw Captain Briggs, a soldier, try to murder 2 people in the house of God. You saw him try to start a war, and you," he pointed at Silas Kane, "you paid for it." "This is an outrage," Kane blustered, but his voice was thin. His power had always come from money and fear, and both were now failing him. "This man," Reed said, pointing to the hired gun who had shot Tani, a man now in chains, "has confessed. He has told us he was paid $50 by Mr. Kane to start the trouble. And this man," he pointed to the other, "was paid to shoot Hatcher and make it look like an Indian raid." The crowd, which had been so quick to form a lynch mob, was now a different kind of mob. They were silent, their faces filled with a cold, righteous anger. They had been lied to. They had been used. They had nearly been led into a massacre that would have brought the full weight of the Comanche nation down on their homes, all for one man's greed. "Silas," Albright said, his voice a low rumble, The railroad is still 100 miles east. That is a long walk. I suggest you start. Silas Kane looked at the faces. There was no pity, no support. His hired guns were dead or gone. His political ally, Briggs, was dead. He was alone. He turned, his shoulders slumped, and walked to the bank. He was gone by nightfall. His wagon loaded, his reputation in ruins. On the third day, a meeting was held. It was not in the church, and not in the saloon. It was on the open prairie, in the buffalo wallow where Tani had fallen, a place consecrated by blood. Greyhawk sat on one side, with Willow Woman and 3 of his senior warriors. Sheriff Reed sat on the other, with Albright, Evelyn, and 2 of the town elders. It was not a meeting of friends. It was a negotiation for survival. "The man you call Briggs is dead," Greyhawk said, his voice flat. "This does not bring back my son, who he killed 2 winters ago, but it is the end." "The man you call Silas is gone," Reed replied, his voice just as tired. "This does not bring back Hatcher or the 2 men Tani killed, but it is the end." Evelyn spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "We must have a new way, or this will happen again and again, until we are all ghosts." They talked all afternoon. They argued, they threatened, they bartered. But in the end, driven by the shared, bloody reality of the battle, they found a path. The Comanche would be given a wide valley, 2 days' ride north, as a permanent hunting ground, a buffer zone. The town of Red Creek, through Sheriff Reed, would file a formal petition with the territorial government, supported by the testimony of the cavalry troopers, that the incident was a criminal conspiracy by Kane and Briggs, not an Indian war. And the railroad? "The Iron Snake," Greyhawk said, "must not come through the hunting grounds. It must not touch the graves of our fathers." Albright, the blacksmith, nodded. "I have seen the maps. They can turn it south. It is harder ground, more expensive, but," he looked at Reed, "with Kane gone, and the town asking they can be made to turn it." And so it was agreed. For the first time, in that small corner of Texas, the English language and the Comanche tongue had built something other than a grave. Evelyn, however, felt a profound sense of dislocation. The battle was won, the truce was made, but where did she belong? She was no longer the Red Creek schoolteacher. The women in town, though no longer hostile, looked at her with a mixture of awe and pity. She was the woman who had lived with the Comanche, the woman who had loved the warrior. She was marked, no longer one of them. But she was not Comanche either. She was Willow Woman's friend. She was Greyhawk's respect, but she was not, and never would be, one of them. She was Tanapakani, a name of honor, but a name that separated her. She was a bridge, and a bridge, she thought, belongs to neither side, and is walked on by both. She thought of Boston, of her father. She could go back, she could try to explain, but the thought of the trimmed lawns and the stifling parlors made her feel like she was suffocating. She was in the warehouse, changing the bandage on Tani's side, when he woke. His eyes, no longer clouded with fever, opened and found hers. He was weak, but he was himself. He watched her for a long time, his hand coming up to touch her face, his fingers tracing the exhaustion under her eyes. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I stayed," she said, her voice thick. He saw the conflict in her face, the deep, aching uncertainty. He knew. He had seen her at the meeting. He saw the space around her, the way both sides treated her with a respect that was also a kind of isolation. "My people are safe. For now," he said, his voice gaining a small measure of strength. "Your people have found the truth." "Yes," she said. "And you," he said, holding her gaze. "You are trapped between them." She looked down, her heart aching. He saw her so clearly. "Evelyn," he said, using her Boston name. "You saved my life. At the tree, you gave me back my breath." He took a ragged breath himself, the wound in his side pulling. "I will not be a new rope. I will not be a chain that holds you here." She looked at him, confused. "In the storm," he said, his voice low. "In the dark, it was a dream. You are free to go back to your Boston. Forget the savage, forget the cold." He turned his head, looking away from her, and the effort cost him dearly. "I will not speak of that night. I do not want love to be a debt." He had done it, the final, hardest thing. He had grown from a warrior seeking vengeance to a man who understood true freedom. He was offering to forget her, not as a threat, but as a gift. He was giving her back her life, her reputation, her world. Evelyn was silent for a full minute, the weight of his words settling on her. He was offering her an escape. He was giving her the choice she thought she had lost. She could leave. She could be Miss Marsh again, the poor, confused woman who had survived a terrible ordeal. She looked at his hand, lying on the canvas, scarred and strong. She looked at his proud profile, turned away from her. She thought of the man who had faced down a lynch mob, who had taught her about the land, who had lied to soldiers to protect her, who had held her and given her his own body heat to keep her alive. She smiled, a small, true smile. She picked up his hand. It was rough and calloused, and it was the only thing in the world that felt like home. She lifted it and pressed his palm flat against her own chest, over her heart. He turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers, wide with surprise. "We do not owe each other, Tani," she said, her voice soft, but as unshakable as the prairie. "We choose each other." She leaned in and kissed him, not with the desperation of the storm, but with the quiet certainty of the morning after. "I am not a wren," she whispered against his lips. "And I am not a bridge. I am a woman, and my place is here. With you." A small schoolhouse was built. It was not in Red Creek, and it was not in the Comanche camp. It was built in the open prairie, halfway between, on a small rise overlooking the creek. It was built of cottonwood from the Comanche lands and nails from Albright's smithy. Evelyn taught. She had children with pale skin and freckles, and children with dark eyes and black hair. She taught them reading and writing and how to speak English. And Tani, his side healed into a long, puckered scar, taught. He taught the white children how to ride, how to track, how to read the clouds, and how to speak Comanche. He taught them the stories of the earth to which they all belonged. Silas Kane was never seen again. The railroad, faced with new surveys, new political pressure, and the sudden, unexplained loss of its chief land agent, turned south. Red Creek became smaller, quieter, a town that had faced its own darkness and chosen, narrowly, to survive. Years passed. The prairie was still a hard land. Peace was still a fragile thing, but it held. One night, in a small cabin built next to the schoolhouse, a man lay in bed, the moonlight striping the floor. A woman was curled beside him, her head on his shoulder, her breathing soft and even. She was no longer the slim girl from Boston. She was a woman, her face lined by sun and laughter, her hands strong. He was no longer the angry, hunted warrior. He was a husband, a father, a teacher. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. She stirred, murmuring in her sleep. "Once," Tani whispered into her hair, his voice rough with an emotion that never faded. "I dreamed every night only of your smile. It was all I had." She turned in his arms, her eyes opening, finding him in the dark. "Now," he said, his voice breaking, "I lie awake, and I am only afraid I will forget to thank the spirits for the day, for the truth of you, here, in my arms." He did not need to dream of her smile. He kissed it. The next morning, the sun rose on the small schoolhouse, a group of children, a mix of Comanche and white, burst from the door, shouting in a broken, beautiful mix of two languages, chasing a stray dog across the endless, open grass. Evelyn stood on the porch, a hand shading her eyes, watching them. Tahni came up beside her, his hand resting on her waist. They stood together, watching their children run toward the future. In the far, far distance, the sun glinted off the new railroad tracks, a thin iron line, heading south, far away from the graves of his fathers. The Wild West had not become a heaven, but here, in this one small place, two people had chosen truth, and in doing so, had built a new and very real kind of freedom. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I have to ask, where in the world are you listening from? Let me know in the comments. I love to see where the tales travel. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you really loved it, please hit that hype button. It helps get these stories out to more folks, and it means the world to me.